Chapter 5. The Desert. Reality slapped Richard in the face after walking off the jet in Las Vegas. What am I doing here? He had packed his bags immediately after leaving Carnegie Hall and taken the next available flight. It was no real inconvenience to him. Climbing onto a jet and sleeping on the way was just one of many things that Richard had gotten used to over the years. He would do anything to further his career. But I've never been a gambler, he reminded himself. Yet here I am, traveling across a continent, hoping that some strange hermit in the middle of the desert will be able to make a better violin than one of the greatest Guarneris in the world. After retrieving his luggage, Richard sat down on a bench so he could think about what he had gotten himself into. He soon found himself staring at the largest slot machine on the other side of the room. My odds would be better if I pulled that handle over there and hoped for $1 million, he thought. Richard glanced towards the car rental desk. And that would only take 1 minute and cost me $1. Richard shook his head. I've never been a gambler. It's your turn, Richard. Richard's cousin Tony had just exited his grandfather's parlor, carrying a large box and sporting a Cheshire cat grin. From the look on Tony's face, Richard knew that things would be good that year, and he decided to enter his grandfather's parlor in a reserved, dignified manner, even though he wanted to run. The rest of the house was bright, clean, and respectable. But the only light in George Gaspar Sr.'s parlor emanated from snarly candles intertwined with ancient trinkets and curiosities. It was eerie and haunting, just the way his grandfather liked it. While Richard's grandmother had been raised a sophisticated woman of social status, his grandfather had lived the life of a gypsy fortune-teller. He had repented of his ways, as his grandmother put it, except for the fortune-telling. It was the only thing that Richard's grandmother was willing to put up with from George Sr.'s past, and it had evolved into a great holiday tradition. The annual fortune-telling was different for each of the grandchildren, and most of them liked grandfather's parlor better than Christmas Day itself. Sometimes the presents received there were the best of all. Richard's eyes scanned every inch of the room. Gold tassels and colored silks were hanging from the walls, with paintings and statues looming between them. Curiosities that boggled Richard's young mind were resting on the shelves below the paintings, including a set of shrunken heads and 2 gold watches. The heads were those of 2 explorers that his grandfather had known when he was young. He had told Richard about how he had read their fortunes and warned them not to go on their journey, then recounted their gruesome demise. The images sometimes gave Richard nightmares, yet he also had many wonderful dreams about all the other things in his grandfather's parlor. Best of all, there was an original oil painting of Niccolo Paganini playing the violin for a woman. Below it was a box containing the same silver ring, set with a large oval-shaped ruby that Paganini was wearing in the painting. There were many other heirlooms that the other grandchildren loved more, but Paganini had always been Richard's favorite. Richard relaxed on a velvet chair in front of an elaborate table. The edges were embellished with ancient symbols and writings, while the legs were deeply carved and covered with gold. His grandfather claimed that it was over 2,000 years old, and Richard had heard many fascinating stories about its past. Richard loved inspecting its surface because it seemed to change every time he came to visit. Instead of a crystal ball and 3 large boxes like the last time Richard had his fortune told, there were 5 silver goblets turned upside down on the table. Richard smiled. No one's fortune had ever been bad, and he knew that great things could come in very small packages. His grandfather's strong, wrinkled hands came to rest on the corners of the table. "This is not a game, Richard," his grandfather announced while his expression became solemn. Richard got the feeling that his fortune was going to be a grown-up one that year. Richard was 11. "And this is not necessarily your future," his grandfather continued. "These cups and what lies beneath them will tell you who you are." "I know who I am, Grandpa. I'm Richard Gaspar, and I'm going to be the greatest violin player who ever lived." His grandfather smiled. He had been the one responsible for Richard starting the violin at such an early age, after presenting him with a small handmade violin. It was the very first time they had sat across from each other, and when Richard learned that his grandfather had carved the violin himself, he prized it above all of his other possessions and begged his parents for lessons. "I know that you will," responded his grandfather with a proud smile, "but this will tell you what kind of person you are." His grandfather touched each of the cups with his right index finger, then placed his hands on his knees. "Choose one." Richard inspected the details on each of the 5 silver goblets. They were exactly the same, but each was very old and worn differently. Richard pointed toward one of the cups and waited. His grandfather shook his head. "So you will never question whether this is real or not. You pick it up." Richard eagerly reached for the center silver cup and lifted it. There were 3 shiny buffalo nickels resting on the table. Richard's eyes grew wide. He loved old coins, but hadn't started a collection of his own yet. His grandfather smiled after seeing Richard's response. "Only touch their edges when you pick them up. They are the rarest of their kind and very valuable." Even though Richard was young, his father had taught him how to handle expensive things, and he carefully admired them with awe. "Thank you very much, Grandfather." Richard knew that if his grandfather said something was valuable, it really was. His grandfather's eyes narrowed. "Now would you like to risk them and try for something worth much more?" Richard looked at the nickels, then at the box sitting below the picture of Paganini. "Is Paganini's ring still in that box over there, Grandpa?" His grandfather smiled. "It is." "Then I'll keep the nickels, no matter what," Richard declared. "Your father has taught you well, Richard. But go ahead and see what you would have gotten." Richard reached over, picked up the first silver cup, and turned it over. There were 5 large gold coins resting underneath. After seeing that Richard was unaffected by the sight of the shimmering gold, his grandfather offered, "Now pick up the others." When Richard lifted each of the other 3 silver cups, there was nothing beneath them. Even though the gold coins were from ancient Greece and worth twice as much as the buffalo nickels, Richard was never sorry for choosing the sure thing. He treasured the 3 buffalo nickels just as much as the small violin he had received when he was 4. "What am I doing here?" Richard asked himself after accepting a set of keys to a 4-wheel drive Blazer parked just outside the glass doors. Samuel had warned Richard that the road leading to the violin shop was rough, and Richard didn't want to take any more chances than he had to. After placing his belongings inside the vehicle, he scoffed at his indecision. It was still morning, and in spite of his misgivings, Richard jumped into the Blazer and merged into traffic. As Richard headed north, his surroundings quickly changed from the glamorous city lights into a barren, windswept desert. He began questioning if what had happened the day before was real or just a dream. after looking across the scorched sand toward the burnt mountains beyond. His concerns deepened. The sight of vulture-pecked bones along the side of the road made Richard glad that he had decided to leave a deposit with the other violin dealer. No matter what he thought he may have heard and seen in the concert hall, he made sure in writing that he had the first rights of refusal to the Guarnerius until the 6 weeks were over. Richard knew that the Guarnerius was a magnificent instrument, one of the finest in existence, with an impressive history and unquestioned provenance. It was everything he wanted, including prestige and status. Yet here he was, traveling through the desert in search of something more. As if that were even possible. Yet the sounds he had heard at Carnegie Hall still haunted him, and the emotions he felt while his 2 dearest friends played upon the other violins were nothing like he had ever experienced. After reconsidering his decision a dozen times, Richard decided to clear his mind and concentrate on the road. The desert quickly infused Richard with a dreamy melancholy, and as the vehicle traveled across the large basin, his eyes wandered to the mountains in the distance. He imagined himself marooned without water, stranded with only snakes and scorpions amidst the rocks and sand. He thought of himself crawling on his hands and knees with the sun beating down, desperately trying to find shade. He wondered if anyone could possibly survive. The only hope, he thought, would be to reach those mountains where there might be shade and water. After making his way across the valley floor and up the shadeless, barren incline, Richard then imagined his dry, sun-bleached bones sitting against one of the hot boulders. He glanced back toward the valley floor in the mirror. Even though it was engulfed in mirages, it now looked pretty good when compared with the rocky, desolate slopes. Mark and Circe had discussed the 2 new violins with Richard, and they had all agreed that neither was right for him. But Mark and Circe also believed that if a violin maker could make both of those instruments, he could also make the instrument that Richard needed. It seemed strange to Richard, though. Who was Sean Diego? And where did he come from? Was he for real? And yet, Richard thought, while looking beyond a cluster of Joshua trees, he must be real enough. Before Circe left the concert hall, she had bought the golden brown violin in the light blue case. Richard remembered when Mark and Circe had to scrape together every penny they could, and how they had begged loans from their closest friends so they could buy her an old Grecian viola. Yet, out of the blue, they had paid almost the same amount for this new violin. Mark hadn't even flinched at the price. He just nodded his approval while Circe balanced their checkbook. The Coppolas weren't poor, but Richard knew that it must have taken all of their savings. When Richard had asked why, and reminded Circe that she was a violist, not a violinist, she replied, "It's what I need. It's very special, Richard. I'll tell you when you get back from your trip with your violin." My trip, he thought. My violin. Richard still had a difficult time imagining the violin of his dreams in a dry, dusty desert. If he were to envision himself buying a violin from a living master, it would have been from one of the shops in Italy. Richard had visited Cremona and talked with many of the makers there during one of his tours. He had wanted to see the City of Masters, where many of the buildings still stood as they had at the time of Stradivarius. He also loved the musty smell of a classic Italian town, with its arched doorways and peaceful inner gardens. He had even taken time to visit the house where Stradivari had lived with his first wife before she died. It was there that Stradivari developed his own style of violin making after working in the shop of Niccolò Amati for almost 28 years. Richard had also inspected the nails in the rafters, where Stradivari hanged his legendary collection of wood. It amazed Richard how such simple tools had shaped some of the greatest violins, violas, and cellos ever known to man. Richard later visited the house where Joseph Guarneri struggled to make his living, just down the street. Joseph had been forced to sell the family home in order to pay his debts. Then he rented it back during the last few years of his life, dying in abject poverty, a childless pauper. Richard wondered about Samuel's words. If he had wandered down that street in 1743 and noticed a violin hanging in that window, would he have bought it? Or would he have said, "No, I need a fine Niccolo Amati or a Jacob Steiner violin. If this Joseph Guarneri is so great, he should be more famous. And everyone knows that it takes at least 50 years for a fine violin to mature." Until the previous day, Richard knew what his answer would have been. Richard glanced at the violin case resting on the back seat. Bergonzi was the greatest apprentice of Antonio Stradivari. It was Carlo, not Stradivari's children, who inherited the great master's finest tools after he died. Richard's violin had been made during the prime of Cremona. Antonio Stradivari was on one corner, Joseph Guarneri down the street, with Carlo Bergonzi just a few blocks away, and a dozen other makers scattered throughout the city, striving to be worthy of the title of Master Luthier. Richard thought about the scar on his Bergonzi's belly, and his mind floated back through the years. "How could you do that to her, Ricky?" demanded his mother. Elaine's hands were on her hips, and she was scowling. "What did I do? Did you see what she and her dog did to my Bergonzi?" Richard held the violin up and showed her the scratch. "That's no excuse for destroying a little girl's feelings and hurting her like that." Elaine loved to use passionate words like destroy. "If you ever hope to become any kind of gentleman, you will go and ask her to forgive you." Richard remained defiant. "I don't even know who she is." "Her name is Michelle Ross, and she lives in the old Pritchard house. She came to say hello and to see if we had any girls her age that she could play with. She was so friendly and commented on how well you played that I thought you would want to meet her." "I hope they plan on cleaning up that old dump." Elaine's voice raised a pitch. "Didn't you hear me, young man?" "Yes, I heard you. You want me to say I'm sorry because she almost ruined my violin." Elaine Gaspar hadn't spanked Richard since he was 5, but Richard knew that he was walking the fine line by the expression on her face. Backing away quickly, not wanting to give her the chance, Richard exclaimed, "Okay, I'm sorry. I'll do it." "And you'll mean it, young man, sincerely, or else." Richard walked back into the study, reluctantly switched off the metronome, and frowned. "I didn't even get to finish my practice time." He took a lot more time than usual wiping off the rosin and putting the Bergonzi away. Then he slid the music into the top pocket of his violin case, one piece at a time. His movements became so leisurely that the zipper's teeth clicked slower than the beat of his metronome. He tilted up the music stand and set it against the wall, then rotated the top and adjusted the legs more than once before leaving it alone. "Now!" his mother yelled, even though she claimed that she never yelled. Her voice made Richard turn, but it didn't speed up his movements as he trudged out of the parlor and into the entry. He meandered across the Persian rug and stared at everything he had seen there 1,000 times before. His mother impatiently opened the front door, and as he walked past, he took an extra minute or two to carefully inspect the planter on the porch. He kicked it twice and wiped his feet on the doormat before continuing toward the stairs. Once he was sure that no one was watching, he hung his head and looked at his feet. Richard didn't like apologizing to anyone, ever. He stopped where Michelle had landed at the base of the stairs. Dumb girl, he thought, while scuffing one of the spots of blood with his shoe. She should have stayed and taken the consequences instead of crying and running away. Yet, when Richard remembered the look on her face, he knew that he had hurt her. Her expression had turned from hope and happiness to despair, right in front of his eyes, and it was his fault. Good, he said out loud, trying to convince himself that she deserved what she got, but not loud enough for his mother to hear. When he reached the gate and lifted the latch, he turned around just to make sure. Yep, there she is, still standing in the doorway, making sure I keep going, with that look on her face. Yep, he ranted in his mind, girls grow up to be women, though he didn't really know what he meant by it. Walking from Richard's house to the old Pritchard home was like taking the elevator from the penthouse in a fine hotel all the way down to the laundry room. The sidewalk was even rougher, and there were more cracks the further he went. He noticed small drops of blood along the way, as well as other evidence that Michelle had fallen more than once after leaving his yard. Richard noticed everything about the sidewalk because he was hanging his head and dragging his feet the entire time. He was still trying to think of what he was going to say and how to say it, so he would look good but still get the job done. When Richard was within sight of the Pritchard house, he turned and walked down the other street instead. It took 3 times around the block before he gathered enough courage to keep going. Michelle's house had one of the rattiest yards in town. There was no fence, and Richard walked directly across the patchy brown grass toward a front door covered with peeling paint. There were cardboard moving boxes everywhere, and a washing machine abandoned in the middle of the lawn. He had seen the moving van parked there 2 days before and wondered what kind of people would buy a dump like this. Richard examined the doorbell closely, while trying to figure out exactly what he was going to say. He had it narrowed down to a couple of options by the time he pushed the button, figuring that he would just play it by ear. When he heard footsteps approaching, he considered bailing out and running. But then he realized, if I did that, I wouldn't be any different than her. The door swung open, and a thin, tired-looking woman with mousy brown hair appeared. "Hello? May I help you?" Margie Ross asked with a tired smile. "Does a Michelle Ross live here?" Richard asked reluctantly. Margie's eyebrows lifted with understanding, and she looked Richard over from head to toe. She had been expecting a little larger monster boy. "You must be Richard. I'm Michelle's mother," Margie replied. This lady already knows, Richard thought. I better be careful. "I came to apologize for how I acted," Richard offered solemnly. "You may want to come back a little later, Richard. Michelle is still pretty upset." Richard knew that his mother would never leave him alone until the deed was done. "Please?" He used the most pathetic voice he could possibly muster. "Can I talk to her for just 1 minute?" Margie hesitated while Richard looked up with pleading eyes. She finally offered, "Come in and we'll see." As Richard stepped inside the door, he instantly sensed that there was more going on than met the eye. He had the feeling that he was walking into an ambush or over the top of a pit filled with tigers. He didn't know why he felt that way. After all, what could an 11-year-old girl and her mother do to him? While tiptoeing down the hall, Richard lingered far enough behind so he could tuck and run if wild panthers leapt out from behind a door, or if man-eating lions appeared from around the corner. As they approached Michelle's bedroom, he heard a noise. "Oh, great," he thought. "It's been over 45 minutes and she's still crying." When Margie opened the door, Michelle's low, moaning sobs and quick, uneven breaths became clear. Richard moved his head around the door jamb and noticed cardboard boxes lining the walls. Then, as he cautiously entered the room, he saw her. Michelle was lying on the bed with her back and legs propped up with pillows. There were large cotton bandages fastened to her knees with medical tape. Both had bright crimson blotches in the middle and trickles of blood running down her legs. A bandage taped to the palm of her right hand kept her from closing it, and long scrapes covered both forearms. Her other elbow was wrapped tightly, and she was holding the arm straight out in front of her. It was the one that she had used to protect her puppy. To make the image worse, there was a bulky white gauze wrapping around Michelle's forehead, holding an ice pack tightly against a large purple lump. The gauze was holding her hair straight up, and the ends drooped down over her red, swollen eyes. "Michelle, honey?" Her mother's words were soft and cautious. Richard remained behind Margie and leaned just enough to one side so he could see around her. He was staring in shock. "Michelle?" she repeated. After a jerky breath and a long, labored sob, Michelle looked up. Upon seeing Richard, she cowered against the headboard and began whimpering like a trapped animal. She covered her face with her arms as though he expected him to reach out and strike her. The little dog rushed forward to the edge of the bed and began barking. His teeth snapped open and closed, while Richard just stood there with his mouth hanging wide open. "I think you better go," Margie announced. Richard was dumbfounded. He simply couldn't move. He knew that he was a little stuck up on the scales of humanity, but he had never physically hurt anyone, let alone tortured anyone in his life. In reality, he had always been the one singled out at school when there was a cruel joke to be played. Richard looked at Michelle and remembered the time he had cried when all the other boys at the baseball field tortured a grasshopper. They had pulled off its legs and laughed at its pain, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Now, right in front of his eyes, lay a helpless 11-year-old girl, cowering back in fear because of him. He knew that he had crossed the line by losing his temper in the study and how he acted on the porch, but he couldn't believe that she thought he would hit or torture her. It only took a moment for something inside Richard to break, something that felt like a fairy tale giant had just grabbed him from behind, put his knee in the small of Richard's back, and snap, right in two. Richard's lower lip started quivering, and tears welled in his eyes. He remembered how Michelle's face looked when she stood in front of him in the parlor, and now he knew how it must have felt. "I'm sorry," he blurted out. His voice cracked. "I didn't know you would get hurt. I didn't mean it. I take it back. I take it all back." Michelle cowered against the headboard with her face turned away. The dog snarled and barked louder. "You need to go now." Mrs. Ross was insistent and placed a hand firmly on Richard's shoulder. "Please forgive me," Richard pleaded, not willing to leave. Michelle didn't answer, and Richard became desperate. "I'll do anything," he cried. When Michelle still didn't respond, Richard broke free and ran to the side of her bed. He knelt down, desperately hoping that she would lower her arms and quit shaking. He wished more than anything that she would forgive him. He begged and pleaded, "I promise, I will do anything." Michelle slowly turned toward Richard and smiled. With wide, innocent eyes still full of tears, she softly whispered, "Be my friend." Richard's thoughts floated out across the hot, dry sand of the desert, and he began smiling through his tears. From that moment on, they were friends.